Tonight, we journey back to a world transformed by survival. A world where ordinary people, farmers, artisans, widows, and wandering monks, all woke each day to a quieter countryside and uncertain skies. In the hush that followed the Great Plague, life did not return to what it had been. Instead, it shifted. Subtly at first, like the gentle turn of seasons, and then with startling clarity. The survivors of the plague didn't just carry on. They quietly rewrote the rhythms of medieval life. As you settle in, let this story unfold like soft pages turning in the candlelight of a distant time. There is no rush here. Just the steady pace of history as it tiptoes through villages, cloisters, and crumbling city walls. If you find yourself drifting into sleep as we go, that's perfectly alright. That means it's working. But if you're still awake, feel free to leave a gentle like and let us know where and when you're listening. Your presence, even silent, means the world. Now, take a deep breath, dim the lights, and nestle in. Let the world of plague survivors and their quiet resilience carry you into another time. When the final waves of the plague receded, what remained was not just devastation, but a world standing at a fragile crossroads. Villages sat half empty, once bustling streets and cities grew still, and the tolling of church bells echoed longer than before. The silence wasn't just physical, it stretched into people's lives, their rhythms, and their understanding of the world. The survivors, those who had lived through the darkest chapters of the Black Death, found themselves wandering through a landscape forever altered. Fields grew wild where once they had been sown with care. Thatched roofs sagged where no hands remained to mend them. The survivors had not just endured a sickness, they had survived a transformation. And though many tried to return to the familiar, the truth was inescapable. Medieval life would never be the same. Across the countryside, landowners faced a problem that few had ever anticipated. Before the plague, peasants had been plentiful and land was precious. Now, the balance had flipped. With so many lives lost, vast tracts of farmland lay fallow. Noble estates that once thrived on the backs of bustling tenant labor now sat idle, and many lords found themselves staring at empty fields and silent mills. At first, there was panic. What would become of the harvests? Who would tend the sheep or grind the grain? But in that vacuum, something remarkable began to happen. The survivors, the laborers and field hands, the shepherds and blacksmiths, were no longer invisible. Suddenly, their work carried immense value, and they knew it. In town after town, wages began to rise. Not because of charity or generosity, but out of necessity. Where once a lord might have refused a higher rate for a hired hand, now he found himself bidding against his neighbors to secure even a single capable worker. It was a quiet revolution, unspoken and unsought, but it was real. Peasants who had lived for generations under the same harsh conditions, bound by tradition and obligation, were beginning to taste freedom. They moved more freely, negotiated more confidently, and for the first time, some began to dream of something beyond mere survival. This shift was not without tension. Governments across Europe, recognizing the growing leverage of the working poor, began to pass laws to hold the old order in place. In England, for instance, the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 sought to freeze wages and restrict movement. These laws were meant to restore the pre-plague hierarchy, to force people back into their former roles. But enforcing such edicts in a world where laborers were scarce and landowners desperate proved difficult. Many simply ignored the rules, trusting that the authorities could not possibly enforce them everywhere. And they were right. Across the realm, quiet defiance became a new norm. The changes weren't only economic. In communities across Europe, the very structure of daily life began to evolve. Religious institutions, which had once held unshakable authority, were suddenly viewed through new eyes. During the plague, many clergy had died, not because they were careless, but because they stayed. They ministered to the dying, buried the dead, and offered last rites when others fled. In their place, some untrained or opportunistic individuals took over, leading to growing distrust among the faithful. And for those who had prayed earnestly for protection and yet watched loved ones perish, questions took root. Why had the plague spared some and not others? Why had the heavens remained silent amid such suffering? These questions did not spark rebellion overnight, but they did plant seeds of doubt, seeds that would quietly grow in the decades to come. Social rituals changed as well. Festivals, once grand and crowded, were quieter or postponed altogether. In some towns, traditions faded entirely as people struggled to make sense of joy in a world still draped in mourning. And yet, in other places, new traditions emerged. Celebrations of survival replaced old feasts. Families gathered not just to honor saints or kings but to remember those they had lost. The very notion of community began to reshape itself. Where once family names and long-standing ties defined your place in the world, now it was shared experience. Who had endured, who had stayed, who had helped. Survivors bonded not just by blood, but by memory. One of the more unexpected transformations unfolded in education. With so many clerics and scribes lost to the plague, a void appeared in the world of letters. Schools affiliated with monasteries and cathedrals found themselves short-staffed, and for the first time, many began accepting students from less privileged backgrounds simply to fill their benches. Books, though still rare and precious, began to circulate more widely as older volumes passed from hand to hand. In some towns, small groups of literate survivors gathered to teach one another. They copied texts by candlelight, discussed sermons they had once heard, and speculated on the meaning of events they had witnessed. It was not a formal reformation, but a quiet blooming of curiosity. The thirst for understanding had grown stronger, not weaker, in the wake of the plague. Within homes, daily routines took on new dimensions. Widows who had once depended entirely on their husbands' incomes were now running businesses, managing estates, and raising children alone. Some remarried, but many did not, and their newfound independence, though often born of necessity, became a quiet challenge to societal norms. Similarly, children who had grown up amid the loss became more adaptable, more resilient. They helped with planting, learned trades early, and in many cases, inherited land or tools far earlier than they would have before. A generation was coming of age that had seen suffering and come through it stronger, if more solemn. Architecture, too, bore the mark of survival. Entire villages were rebuilt with wider streets, better airflow, and sturdier walls. It wasn't just aesthetic, it was practical. People now understood, even without scientific clarity, that air, space, and cleanliness mattered. Wells were better protected. Waste disposal became more organized. Some cities even introduced rudimentary public health rules, including cleaning regulations for streets and markets. These were small steps, but they marked a profound shift in how people thought about their environments and their neighbors. Art and storytelling also took on new tones. While religious themes remained central, there was a surge in depictions of everyday life: farmers at work, families at meals, markets in motion. Survivors sought comfort not in grand depictions of heaven or judgment, but in the familiar. Songs, poems, and painted images reminded them of what they had lost and what they still held. And beneath it all pulsed a quiet determination, a will to remember, but also to move forward. Perhaps most telling of all was the rise in mobility. For generations, most medieval people had been tied to a single village or town, often for life. But after the plague, with so many roles left unfilled, people began to travel. A young man might walk 50 miles for a better wage. A widow might leave her husband's village to return to her childhood home. Skilled workers were welcomed far and wide. Guilds expanded. Merchant routes reopened. And though the roads remained dangerous, they were filled once again, not just with trade goods, but with possibility. This first chapter in the post-plague world reveals a tapestry not of destruction alone, but of adaptation. Survivors didn't simply endure. They reshaped the very fabric of society, economically, socially, spiritually, and even architecturally. Their resilience laid the groundwork for a new chapter in European history, one that would unfold slowly but decisively across the next 100 years. The shifting balance of power in post-plague medieval society could be felt most acutely in the realm of labor. Before the plague, the rigid structure of feudalism ensured that landowners held all the cards. Lords dictated the terms, peasants toiled with few options, and the rhythms of work were bound to centuries-old customs. But after the Black Death swept through Europe, reducing populations by as much as half in some regions, everything changed. Fields lay abandoned, crops withered for lack of hands, and once feared nobles suddenly found themselves pleading for help from those who had once been beneath notice. It was not just a crisis, it was an awakening. In the immediate aftermath, landowners faced a desperate shortage of workers. Manors that had once boasted thriving communities now echoed with emptiness. Serfs and peasants who remained suddenly discovered that their labor was not only valuable, it was indispensable. For the first time in memory, they had bargaining power. Wages rose not because of kindness or justice but because the economic machine required it. Without someone to plow the fields, tend the sheep, or repair the walls, entire estates would collapse. So landlords competed. They offered coin, food, and even housing to entice laborers. And those who had long been shackled to the land now found themselves with choices. This new reality gave rise to a quiet but profound shift in mindset. The laborer, once overlooked, began to recognize his worth. He might leave a lord who treated him poorly for another who offered better terms. Word traveled quickly among peasant communities, and the movement of workers from village to village became increasingly common. For centuries, birth had determined one's station in life. Now, survival had opened the door to mobility. And with mobility came ambition. The changes extended beyond individual laborers. Entire communities began to assert themselves. In some places, village councils formed to negotiate collectively with local lords. They sought better rents, more favorable terms of tenure, and protections for those who had stayed during the worst of the plague. And remarkably, some landowners agreed. They were in no position to refuse. This rise in negotiation did not erase hardship, nor did it eliminate inequality, but it cracked the foundation of an immovable system. The notion that a peasant might have a voice, that he could say no, was revolutionary. Craftsmen in towns and cities experienced a similar transformation. Shoemakers, weavers, masons, and metalworkers all found themselves in high demand. The guilds that governed trades tightened their control to prevent wages from spiraling beyond their reach, but enforcement was difficult. A talented mason could easily find work rebuilding walls, cathedrals, or even bridges damaged by years of neglect. And he could name his price. As a result, many craftsmen accumulated wealth, albeit modest, and with it came a taste of independence. Markets began to bustle again, but the character of those markets changed. Small merchants rose in prominence, and families who had once been mere shopkeepers now controlled thriving businesses. Survivors, especially those who had inherited tools, goods, or land from relatives who did not survive, found themselves unexpectedly prosperous. Some reinvested, opening new stalls, hiring apprentices, and expanding into neighboring towns. The devastation of the plague had created gaps in the social and economic fabric, and into those gaps poured opportunity. Even within the manor system, cracks widened. Traditional feudal dues, like labor services owed to the lord, became harder to enforce. Many tenants negotiated fixed rents instead, allowing them more control over their time and output. Fixed rent arrangements provided stability for both parties, and over time, they contributed to the slow erosion of feudal obligations. It was a subtle evolution, but a critical one. The legal language may have remained the same, but in practice, the relationship between lord and laborer was changing. Resistance to this shift was inevitable. In England and elsewhere, lawmakers sought to reinstate the old order. Sumptuary laws were passed to prevent commoners from dressing above their station. These laws dictated the kinds of fabrics, colors, and adornments that different classes could wear, attempting to preserve visible boundaries of status. The idea that a farmer might wear a fur-lined cloak or a mason might dine on roast meat seemed to unsettle the elite more than the labor crisis itself. Yet enforcement proved difficult. Local officials often looked the other way, or were themselves rising from humble origins and reluctant to punish their peers. Religious institutions also took note of the shifting order. Monasteries and churches, many of which had lost a significant portion of their members, faced their own labor shortages. Some responded by easing restrictions on who could join, admitting novices from backgrounds previously considered unworthy. Others found themselves managing land without enough hands to work it, prompting them to lease properties to tenants on more favorable terms. In doing so, even the church became a participant in the new labor economy. And with more lay people involved in religious life, spiritual authority began to decentralize. While bishops and abbots still held sway, local priests and community leaders gained influence. In rural areas, the loss of population led to the abandonment of marginal lands. Villagers consolidated their efforts on the most fertile fields, leaving rocky hillsides or swampy patches to nature. This return of land to the wild may have seemed like a retreat, but in many cases, it allowed communities to farm more efficiently. Rotations improved, yields stabilized, and the reduced pressure on resources contributed to healthier livestock and better nutrition. What had once been an overworked and exhausted landscape began to recover, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. Perhaps one of the most striking developments was the emergence of a new class of small landowners. In some cases, entire families had perished, leaving no heirs. In others, landowners sold off parcels to cover debts or raise quick funds. Survivors, especially those who had saved wages or inherited wealth, began buying land. A blacksmith who had once rented a narrow strip of pasture might now own a small holding. A widow who had run her late husband's farm during the plague might now have legal title to it. These were modest acquisitions, but they signaled a broader democratization of land ownership. Women, too, saw their roles transformed. With so many men lost to the plague, women assumed positions of authority within households, businesses, and even communities. Some became heads of guild workshops. Others managed taverns, bakeries, or cloth stalls in the market square. While many of these roles were born out of necessity, their success proved enduring. Even after men returned to these trades, the memory of women's competence remained, subtly reshaping gender expectations. Urban centers saw a rapid influx of laborers seeking opportunity. Cities such as Florence, Paris, and London offered the promise of wages, shelter, and commerce. Yet they also presented risks. Disease still lingered in crowded alleys and unsanitary quarters. To mitigate these threats, city leaders began introducing basic health measures. Some cities organized street cleaning crews, regulated waste disposal, and designated burial grounds outside city limits. These measures, though rudimentary, marked the beginning of municipal efforts to manage public health, efforts that would grow in complexity over time. This rise of the commoner did not come without unrest. In the latter half of the 14th century, Europe saw several major uprisings. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 stood as a stark reminder that the post-plague order remained unsettled. Led by figures such as Wat Tyler and John Ball, the revolt was sparked by resentment over poll taxes, wage restrictions, and lingering feudal obligations. Though the rebellion was eventually suppressed, its message echoed across the continent. The survivors of the plague were no longer willing to accept the old rules unquestioningly. Education and literacy saw modest gains during this period as well. More children of artisans and merchants attended local schools. Latin, once reserved for clergy, began to share space with vernacular languages in documents and literature. This shift allowed a broader swath of the population to access information, understand contracts, and participate in civic life. Knowledge, like labor, was slowly becoming more widely distributed. By the end of the century, the European social order looked markedly different from the one that had existed a few generations earlier. The transformation had not been uniform or universally beneficial, but it had been real. The laborer who once toiled in silence now negotiated his worth. The craftsman who once rented a stall now owned it. The widow who once mourned in the shadows now led her household with strength. This chapter in the history of plague survivors tells a story not only of resilience but of ascendance, of ordinary people stepping into roles once deemed beyond their reach. The plague had been a great leveler, indiscriminate in its toll. But in the wake of its destruction, those who survived found themselves standing on new ground. Their feet were sore, their hearts heavy, but their eyes had lifted. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it was theirs to walk. As the physical world reshaped itself after the plague, so too did the spiritual world. For centuries, the medieval church had stood as the central authority in daily life, offering answers, rituals, and structure in a world that was often uncertain and harsh. The local parish was not merely a place of worship, it was a social hub, a source of education, a keeper of records, and a mediator between the living and the divine. Yet, when the plague arrived with its waves of suffering and loss, the spiritual assurance people had once clung to began to waver. The survivors carried more than grief into the future, they carried doubt, and with it, a reshaping of how faith was practiced and understood. The impact of the Black Death on the clergy was staggering. In some regions, as many as half of the priests and monks perished. This loss was not just numerical, it was deeply personal to the communities they served. These were the men who baptized children, heard confessions, led burials, and guided spiritual life. As the plague raged, many clergy stood beside the dying, risking their own lives to offer last rites and comfort. Their sacrifice earned admiration, but their absence left a void. In the aftermath, that void was not always filled by individuals of the same spiritual depth or training. To maintain religious services, the church began ordaining replacements quickly, often too quickly. Some new priests were undereducated, unfamiliar with doctrine, and more focused on status than service. As this became evident, lay people grew uneasy. Sermons became inconsistent, rituals were rushed, and the sacred no longer felt as grounded. This undermining of confidence in church leadership did not lead to widespread rebellion or rejection, but it did plant subtle, persistent questions. If the church had been unable to protect them or explain the plague's purpose, could it still be trusted to guide them? In parallel, new expressions of spirituality began to emerge. Among the most notable were lay religious movements that formed outside of official church hierarchy. The flagellants, for instance, traveled from town to town in public displays of penance, whipping themselves as a form of spiritual atonement for humanity's sins. While some communities welcomed them, others grew disturbed by their intensity. Eventually, church authorities condemned their practices, fearing the challenge they posed to centralized religious control. Yet their popularity, even briefly, revealed a hunger for spiritual expression that felt more immediate, emotional, and direct. Pilgrimage also saw a resurgence, though now driven by different motivations. Before the plague, many pilgrims journeyed to holy sites seeking miracles or forgiveness. After the plague, pilgrimage became an act of reflection and gratitude. Survivors walked for days, sometimes weeks, to give thanks for their preservation, to pray for lost loved ones, or to seek peace after enduring trauma. These journeys, often undertaken in silence or solitude, became deeply personal experiences. The communal aspect of religion was still present, but increasingly individuals sought their own understanding of the divine. Within monasteries, the spiritual and practical responses to the plague varied. Some orders, decimated by loss, closed their doors or merged with others. Others adapted, opening their libraries to scholars or shifting their focus toward healing and herbal medicine. A few became sanctuaries for orphans and widows, offering shelter and education. This transformation of purpose reflected a broader trend, the shift from rigid spiritual discipline toward compassionate service. Monasteries remained centers of learning and devotion, but they were now more deeply entwined with the needs of the living world. Architecture and church art also evolved in the post-plague years. The stark images of suffering, death, and judgment became more prominent in murals, frescoes, and illuminated manuscripts. Skulls, skeletons, and the figure of death itself appeared frequently, not to frighten, but to remind. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a common motif, depicting people from all walks of life, kings, peasants, clergy, dancing hand in hand with death. It was a powerful reminder of mortality's reach, but also of shared humanity. No one was immune, and thus all were equal in the eyes of time and eternity. Despite the darker imagery, a subtle hope wove through these expressions. In many paintings and carvings, death was not portrayed as an end but as a transition. Angels hovered near the dying. souls rose like light. The faithful clung to the promise that suffering had meaning, even if it could not be fully understood. This blend of sorrow and solace defined much of the post-plague spiritual world, a faith tempered by loss, but not extinguished. Parish churches began to reflect the local community more than ever before. With so many clergy gone, lay people stepped into roles traditionally reserved for the ordained. They maintained church grounds, organized gatherings, and sometimes led prayers or readings. This democratization of religious life did not always sit well with church leaders, but it was difficult to suppress. Faith had become more personal, and with it, more flexible. People continued to attend Mass, but they also held prayer circles at home, read devotional texts aloud to neighbors, and shared stories of visions, dreams, and divine signs. One of the most significant developments was the increase in wills and endowments directed toward local churches and chapels. Survivors, especially those who had gained wealth or property, often made gifts to their parish in memory of the dead. They funded altars, stained glass windows, and even entire chapels bearing the names of loved ones. These acts of giving served multiple purposes: spiritual security, community legacy, and personal comfort. They also contributed to the architectural richness of many village churches, leaving behind a visual testament to lives remembered. Education took on a new spiritual dimension as well. In towns where scribes had survived, new devotional texts were copied in vernacular languages rather than Latin. These books, often richly illustrated, allowed ordinary people to engage with Scripture and prayer in ways that had previously been inaccessible. Literacy slowly spread, and with it, a deeper spiritual independence. People no longer had to rely entirely on priests to interpret the Word. They could read and reflect for themselves. This subtle shift laid the groundwork for broader religious questioning that would emerge in the centuries to follow. Across Europe, religious festivals were reshaped to reflect the new realities. Some saints rose in popularity due to their association with healing or protection. Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, for example, were widely venerated as protectors against the plague. Communities organized processions, built shrines, and commissioned statues in their honor. These rituals provided comfort, structure, and a sense of communal strength. Even as traditional liturgies continued, these newer practices demonstrated the adaptability of faith in a changing world. Among children, spiritual understanding took on new forms. Many had seen the world in case and had grown up with prayers whispered over the sickbed and candles lit for the departed. Their concept of faith was shaped not by catechism alone, but by lived experience. They learned that prayers might not always bring healing, but they brought presence. They saw their elders cry and still kneel in devotion. And they carried this nuanced, tender form of belief into adulthood. Perhaps the most profound change was invisible, a softening of the line between sacred and secular. In the post-plague world, people found the divine in more places. A recovered field, a child's laughter, a shared meal, these became acts of grace. The church remained, its rituals unchanged in form, but its meaning deepened by a generation that had seen life reduced to its barest elements, and still found cause to kneel and give thanks. Faith did not shatter under the weight of suffering. It evolved. It became quieter, more reflective, more intertwined with daily life. Survivors did not abandon the church, but they carried something new into its halls, a lived understanding that holiness could dwell in hardship, and that prayer, even unanswered, was still worth the breath it took to speak. The physical world left behind by the plague was eerily quiet. Villages that once bustled with life now lay scattered with vacant homes, neglected farms, and half-built structures whose builders had never returned. The survivors who remained did not merely pick up where things had left off. They couldn't. Too much had changed. Instead, they began to rebuild in ways both practical and profound. The way people lived, how they worked, how they interacted, even how they moved through space, was quietly transformed. The post-plague period was not just an age of healing but one of reimagining daily life. One of the first noticeable changes came in the layout of villages and towns. Some settlements, particularly those that had been hardest hit or completely abandoned, were never reoccupied. Nature crept back in. Roofs collapsed under moss, trees sprouted in fields, and birds nested in the remnants of once busy cottages. But in places where people returned, rebuilding efforts took on a new tone. Survivors didn't simply restore homes and churches to their former states. They improved them, often drawing from hard-learned lessons about space, airflow, and proximity. Many medieval streets had been narrow, cramped, and meandering, ideal conditions for disease to spread and linger. In the rebuilding process, some towns widened their roads, opened public spaces, and reduced overcrowding. It wasn't always planned or coordinated, but even small changes, like placing homes farther apart or building wells at safer distances from latrines, hinted at a shift in understanding. People began to value cleanliness, space, and order in ways they hadn't before. These weren't modern sanitation standards, of course, but they were the roots of what would later become public health thinking. In the countryside, the changes were even more dramatic. Entire farms had been left untended for years. Fences had crumbled, animals had gone feral, and once tamed land had reverted to wild. Those who returned, or those who newly claimed land, found themselves not just repairing but reshaping. New boundaries were drawn. Some chose to consolidate their holdings, abandoning hard-to-reach plots in favor of more fertile ground. Others divided large areas among surviving family members, leading to smaller, more manageable farms. The very concept of land ownership became more fluid as inheritance rules adapted to account for families decimated by loss. The materials and methods of building also changed. Thatched roofs, though common, were highly flammable and hard to maintain. In some areas, people began to experiment with wooden shingles or even tiles where resources allowed. Stone, though more expensive and labor-intensive, gained popularity for its durability and resistance to weather. Houses grew sturdier, not just for comfort, but because the people who built them had witnessed fragility up close and desired a greater sense of permanence. Interior spaces began to reflect new values. Hearths remained central to the home, but storage became more prominent. Pantries, cellars, and cupboards took on greater importance. Survivors, shaped by scarcity, became keenly aware of the need to preserve and prepare. Households that had once taken daily bread and meat for granted now stored grain, dried herbs, and salted fish whenever possible. Kitchens grew in size and complexity, and tools for brewing, baking, and curing meats became more widespread, even among modest homes. Communal buildings, too, underwent transformation. Guild halls were rebuilt with larger meeting rooms. Market squares were refurbished to accommodate new traders and goods. Even small villages made efforts to enhance their central spaces. Wells were fortified, benches installed near chapels, and wooden shelters built for gatherings. These were not grand monuments, but they spoke to a desire for connection. After years of isolation and fear, people craved shared experiences, however simple. One of the more touching developments was the rise of memorial architecture. In towns and villages across Europe, small shrines, stone crosses, and prayer niches appeared, not commissioned by kings or bishops, but by local families and communities. These structures often bore simple inscriptions, initials, dates, symbols of hope or remembrance. They marked spots where loved ones had passed, or where a family had made it through together. In time, these humble monuments became woven into the daily landscape. Children played nearby, merchants rested in their shade, and passers-by paused to reflect. Memory became a part of the geography. Schools, though still rare in rural areas, saw modest expansion. With so many clerics gone, local communities sometimes hired literate individuals to teach the basics: reading, numbers, and religious instruction. These makeshift schools might meet in someone's home, the corner of a chapel, or under a tree when the weather was kind. Though the formal curriculum was limited, the atmosphere often brimmed with curiosity. Children who had witnessed so much in their early years carried a certain seriousness, but also a hunger to understand. Clothing changed in subtle ways as well. Sumptuary laws still governed what certain classes could wear, but enforcement became inconsistent. Fabrics that had once been too expensive for peasants, like dyed wool or linen with simple embroidery, became more accessible due to disrupted trade patterns and the redistribution of wealth. Survivors, especially those who had inherited garments from deceased relatives or employers, wore clothes that would once have been above their station. These changes were not always about vanity. Sometimes they were acts of remembrance. A widow might wear her husband's cloak. A child might use a scarf stitched by a lost grandmother. In this way, fashion became a quiet tribute. Diet and food culture underwent a noticeable shift. The shortage of labor meant that certain labor-intensive crops were less commonly grown. Grains like rye and barley remained staples, but some areas shifted toward crops that required less care or could be traded for finished goods. Livestock farming increased in some regions, especially sheep, whose wool provided both clothing and economic leverage. With more space and fewer people, animals often fared better. Meat, once a luxury for peasants, became slightly more common, not daily fare, but no longer unattainable. Recipes, too, adapted. Dishes became simpler, focusing on what could be grown or preserved easily. Soups and stews took center stage, combining roots, herbs, and scraps into nourishing meals. In the rhythm of the day, survivors adapted their routines. The fear that had gripped communities during the plague left behind a desire for structure and predictability. Bells rang not only for prayers but for work hours, meal times, and curfews. These markers helped restore a sense of normalcy. People woke with the sun, tended to their tasks, and gathered in the evenings with a renewed appreciation for rest and ritual. Singing, storytelling, and communal meals became cherished moments, not just diversions. Relationships also evolved. Marriages were often entered into quickly, driven by practical needs as well as emotion. With so many widows and widowers, the concept of love was tempered by survival. Couples joined to share land, raise children, and rebuild households. Yet these unions were not without affection. In many cases, they were partnerships forged in shared hardship. Likewise, friendships deepened. Those who had supported one another through illness or grief often became as close as family. This bond of shared experience became a cornerstone of community life. The legal system began to reflect these new realities. Local courts had to navigate questions of inheritance, guardianship, and property rights in a landscape where traditional lines had been broken. Judges heard cases from orphans, remarried widows, and neighbors disputing over land left by the deceased. While not always fair by modern standards, the courts showed an increased willingness to adapt. Customary law gave way in some places to more flexible arrangements, prioritizing continuity and local consensus over rigid precedent. As new life slowly settled over the landscape, festivals and holidays resumed. At first, they were cautious, small gatherings, quiet processions, moments of candlelight and prayer. But over time, laughter returned. Children danced in the streets again. Musicians plucked lutes and drums in the town square. And though the memory of the plague never disappeared, it became woven into songs, stories, and traditions. In some towns, an annual feast of remembrance was established, blending mourning with gratitude. These events reminded everyone of what had been lost, but also of what had endured. The rebuilding of daily life in the aftermath of the plague was not a return to the old ways. It was a conscious, ongoing act of transformation. People did not forget what had happened, they built in response to it. Their homes were sturdier, their routines more thoughtful, their relationships more tender. The world had cracked open, but in the rebuilding, a deeper sense of meaning began to grow. In the quiet chaos left behind by the plague, one of the most profound and lasting shifts unfolded not in architecture or governance, but in the daily lives of women. Before the Black Death, most women in medieval Europe lived within rigid societal expectations, their roles largely confined to the home, family, or religious life. They were daughters until they married, wives until they bore sons, and widows if they outlived their husbands. Few held property, fewer had independence, and their contributions, though essential, were often unrecognized. But when the plague swept through cities and villages, leaving homes broken and men absent from their usual posts, women stepped forward into spaces previously closed to them. What began as necessity gradually became a quiet transformation, one that would change how women were seen, and how they saw themselves. The immediate aftermath of the plague brought overwhelming loss. In some villages, entire households were wiped out. In others, women found themselves the sole survivors of their family. These women, mothers, sisters, daughters, were suddenly responsible for maintaining property, feeding themselves, and caring for orphaned relatives or neighbors. The legal systems of medieval Europe were not fully equipped for this, but neither could they ignore it. In many places, exceptions were made. Women inherited land, continued to run businesses, and were granted authority in local matters simply because there was no one else left to take up the task. And they did so capably. In towns and cities, women took over market stalls that once belonged to husbands or fathers. They brewed ale, spun wool, and sold vegetables, not just as helpers, but as primary vendors. They negotiated prices, hired laborers, and kept ledgers. In some guilds, particularly those related to textiles, women began to be recognized in their own right. Though full membership in most guilds remained out of reach, many allowed widows to continue their husbands' trades or permitted daughters to train within the household. The result was a growing presence of women in the economic life of the community, often quietly but unmistakably. In rural areas, the changes were even more striking. Women ran farms, negotiated with landowners, and made planting decisions. The rhythms of agricultural life, from sowing to harvesting to tending livestock, became shared or entirely female responsibilities. This wasn't always celebrated by authorities, but it was tolerated. The land needed tending, and those who stepped forward were rarely turned away. Over time, some women even began leasing land in their own names or joining with other women to manage large holdings left vacant by the deaths of landlords or heirs. Marriage customs also evolved during this period. With so many men lost, the ratio of eligible women to men shifted dramatically. This meant that women had more choice, or at least more leverage, when it came to selecting a partner. In many cases, women delayed marriage until it suited their circumstances, or chose spouses based on practical considerations like shared property or business prospects. Some chose not to remarry at all. Widows, especially those with inherited assets or established businesses, sometimes found greater independence outside of marriage. Though societal pressures remained strong, the post-plague period allowed for a quiet increase in female autonomy. In households, women's roles also deepened in complexity. Beyond childrearing and cooking, they became caretakers of family memory. They passed down stories of those who had died, preserved heirlooms, and organized commemorative rituals. These acts, often informal and unrecorded, became vital in rebuilding community identity. Women, through song, prayer, and storytelling, served as keepers of continuity in a fractured world. Religious life offered another avenue for change. Convents, which had also suffered great losses during the plague, began to welcome more women, often from less wealthy backgrounds than before. This democratization of entry meant that more women had access to literacy, learning, and leadership within the spiritual community. Nuns ran hospitals, taught children, copied manuscripts, and managed considerable land holdings. In the absence of male leadership, abbesses in particular wielded significant influence, overseeing not just spiritual matters but economic and social decisions as well. The arts began to reflect these changes. In illuminated manuscripts, women appeared not just as symbolic figures but as active participants, teaching, healing, praying, and working. In songs and ballads, female characters displayed greater agency, often portrayed as clever, resourceful, or resilient. This was not a wholesale reimagining of gender roles, but it did mark a shift in tone. The experience of widespread loss and survival had carved out new narratives, and women were central to many of them. Legal records from this time offer a glimpse into how women navigated their newfound responsibilities. Court documents include cases of women suing for property rights, defending their business practices, or petitioning for guardianship of orphaned children. Though outcomes varied, the fact that women felt entitled to bring these claims, and were sometimes successful, is telling. They were no longer merely supporting characters in a male-dominated world. They were emerging as active agents in shaping their futures. One of the more subtle but enduring shifts was in education. While formal schooling remained limited, especially for girls, the increased visibility of women in public and economic life encouraged some families to invest in literacy for their daughters. Girls who could read, write, or keep accounts became valuable contributors to family businesses. In wealthier households, daughters were sometimes taught alongside sons, particularly when the family's future rested on their abilities. This slow expansion of learning laid important groundwork for the broader intellectual awakenings to come. In matters of health and healing, women took on crucial roles. With fewer doctors available, many turned to local women for remedies, advice, and comfort. These female healers, often midwives, herbalists, or wise women, became trusted figures in their communities. They gathered knowledge passed down through generations, experimented with plants and tinctures, and treated everything from fevers to wounds. Though later centuries would bring suspicion and persecution to such women, during the post-plague years, their expertise was often respected, and their services sought out. Even in the realm of politics, women made quiet inroads. While few held formal titles, some acted as regents for young heirs, managed estates in the absence of male relatives, or advised local leaders. In a world where survival demanded competence more than pedigree, ability sometimes overrode custom. Letters survived from women negotiating trade deals, settling disputes, and corresponding with bishops or nobles. These moments, though exceptional, highlight the expanding boundaries of what was possible. The emotional landscape of women's lives also shifted. Grief, of course, was widespread, but so too was resilience. Diaries and letters from the era, where they exist, reveal a remarkable strength of spirit. Women wrote about rebuilding homes, raising children alone, and finding solace in community. They described watching fields turn green again, hearing laughter return to village squares, and feeling hope stir in the eyes of a newborn child. These private reflections, though few, illuminate a truth often lost in historical summary, that survival itself became a kind of power. As the decades unfolded, many of these changes endured. Not all women gained independence, and not every community embraced new roles. But the precedent had been set. The image of a woman managing a workshop, arguing a case in court, or tending both child and business no longer seemed impossible. And in that expanded imagination, a foundation was laid for the future. The post-plague transformation of women's roles in medieval society was not marked by revolution, but by quiet determination. In the spaces left by loss, women stepped forward, not just to fill gaps, but to build something new. Through labor, leadership, faith, and family, they shaped a world that was more resilient, more inclusive, and more aware of the strength that had so long gone unnoticed. In the medieval world before the plague, education was often a privilege reserved for the few. Cathedrals and monasteries served as the main centers of learning, and the vast majority of the population, especially in rural areas, remained illiterate. For most peasants, there was little reason to learn to read or write. Their lives were ruled by the rhythm of the land, the dictates of the church, and the seasonal demands of agriculture. Knowledge was passed down orally, and skills were learned by doing, not from books. But when the Black Death swept through Europe, it did more than empty villages and darken homes, it disrupted systems. With so many learned men among the dead and so many roles suddenly vacant, the structures that once guarded knowledge had to adapt. What began as a crisis soon opened unexpected doors, and into those spaces stepped a generation of survivors hungry to learn. The loss of educated clergy created one of the first openings. Before the plague, monks, priests, and scholars were the keepers of knowledge. They copied manuscripts, maintained libraries, and taught the few pupils lucky enough to study at their feet. But the plague claimed their lives in great numbers. Some monastic libraries were left unstaffed, their halls silent and scrolls untouched. Parish priests, once the sole literate figure in a village, were suddenly gone. This absence created a vacuum, not only in religious life but in the transmission of ideas. Communities needed people who could read proclamations, maintain records, and correspond with distant contacts. Suddenly, literacy was not just a luxury, it was a practical necessity. In this new reality, education began to move out of the cloister and into the home, the workshop, and the market square. Wealthier families, especially those in urban centers, started hiring private tutors not only for their sons but sometimes for their daughters as well. The merchant class, which had begun rising in prominence even before the plague, now saw education as a tool for survival and advancement. Reading, writing, and arithmetic became skills that could secure better contracts, manage growing businesses, and keep pace with the changing world. The plague had reshuffled society's deck, and literacy became one of the new aces. Even among the working poor, the perception of learning began to shift. In towns, informal schools began to appear. These were often small, sometimes just a single teacher and a handful of children, but they marked a meaningful departure from the past. The curriculum was simple: reading from religious texts, copying letters, and basic sums. But for a child whose parents had survived the worst, these lessons were more than academic. They represented hope, stability, and a path towards something more secure than what their elders had known. Religious instruction remained a major motivator for learning. With fewer priests available to lead services, many communities relied on literate laypeople to read scripture aloud during gatherings. Psalters, books of psalms and prayers, were among the first texts to be widely shared and copied in local languages. A father who could read might teach his children a passage each evening. A widow might recite verses to find comfort in her grief. In time, this blending of personal devotion and literacy laid the groundwork for later movements that would place even greater emphasis on direct engagement with sacred texts. The written word began to take on a new presence in daily life. Notices were pinned to doors announcing market days, taxes, or new laws. Letters were exchanged between relatives in distant villages, especially when family lines had been disrupted by loss. Local officials kept records of land transfers, court decisions, and apprenticeships. All of this required scribes, men and, increasingly, women, who could put thought to parchment. In some cases, the children of plague survivors took on this work, their nimble hands and clear eyes ideal for long hours of writing. Scribes became valued members of the community, bridging the gap between oral tradition and the growing permanence of written records. This quiet educational revolution also began to affect the trades. Apprentices were not only expected to learn the tools of their trade but also to read contracts, count inventory, and write receipts. Some guilds began to require a basic level of literacy for membership or advancement. In the textile industry, which flourished in the decades following the plague, record-keeping became essential for managing complex networks of suppliers, weavers, and merchants. A young weaver who could read dye recipes or write down patterns had an advantage. The same was true for bakers, brewers, and masons. Reading was no longer just for scholars, it had become a trade skill. Universities, too, felt the effects of the changing world. Enrollment initially dropped during the plague years, as students and faculty alike succumbed to illness. But by the second half of the 14th century, enrollment began to climb again, this time with students from a broader range of backgrounds. Some came with the support of local patrons or guilds eager to invest in young minds. Others arrived on their own initiative, driven by curiosity and the hope that learning might offer a better future. Universities responded by expanding their curricula, offering courses not only in theology and law but also in medicine, rhetoric, and natural philosophy. The intellectual map of Europe was slowly redrawing itself. The physical materials of learning also evolved. Parchment, once the primary medium for writing, was expensive and difficult to produce. In response to growing demand, paper, imported from the Islamic world and increasingly produced in European mills, became more common. It was cheaper, lighter, and easier to use. This made books and documents more accessible, even to those without great wealth. While manuscripts remained treasures, their cost and scarcity no longer made them untouchable. The written word began to find its way into homes, not just monasteries. In art and architecture, the influence of education could be seen in the depiction of teachers, students, and scholars. Wall paintings in churches and homes sometimes included scenes of instruction, monks teaching children, clerks reading aloud to crowds, or parents pointing to a book on a shelf. These images helped normalize learning and made it aspirational. Just as saints and kings had once been idealized, so too were those who held knowledge. The idea that anyone might learn, that wisdom was not reserved for the elite, began to take root. The impact of this quiet rise in literacy extended beyond the classroom. With more people reading, ideas could travel farther and faster. News of events in distant regions, be it a rebellion, a natural disaster, or a royal decree, spread not just by word of mouth but by written message. This helped create a sense of connectedness among communities that had once felt isolated. People began to understand themselves not only as members of a village but as participants in a wider world. For women, the expanding world of letters brought new opportunities and subtle shifts in identity. Girls who learned to read and write were better positioned to run businesses, correspond with clients, or manage household accounts. Nuns continued to play a crucial role in education, especially for girls. Convents housed some of the most comprehensive libraries in Europe and produced women well-versed in scripture, music, medicine, and philosophy. Their influence extended quietly into the communities they served. The ripple effect of learning even reached the poorest in society. While few peasants learned to read in this generation, their children or grandchildren often did. Village elders sometimes pooled resources to send a promising young person to school in a nearby town. These students might return as clerks, teachers, or scribes, helping to guide their neighbors and bridge the gap between oral and written knowledge. They became living libraries, repositories of memory and record. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of this transformation was its organic nature. There was no central plan, no sweeping reform decreed by kings or councils. Rather, the rise of education and literacy grew out of necessity, compassion, and the simple human drive to understand. Survivors of the plague had seen a world fall apart. In rebuilding it, they reached for tools that could help them make sense of it, and books, letters, and learning proved among the most powerful. By the end of the century, literacy was still far from universal, but it was no longer exceptional. The seeds had been planted. From them would grow a Europe more literate, more curious, and more open to the transformative power of ideas. And at its heart was the memory of a great sorrow, and the determination of its survivors to rise not only in body, but in mind. In the aftermath of the plague, the medieval world grew paradoxically smaller and larger at once. The bonds of community tightened as people clung to those who had survived, yet at the same time, new opportunities drew individuals and families further afield. The devastation wrought by the Black Death had fractured long-standing systems, but in those cracks, new connections began to take root. Trade, once the domain of a select few, began to flourish anew. Travel, which had been feared during the height of the contagion, became a path toward promise and reinvention. Survivors were no longer merely seeking to return to what was, they were stepping into what could be. And that shift sent ripples across towns, markets, and entire continents. Before the plague, trade routes had crisscrossed Europe in patterns familiar and predictable. Merchants moved goods along dusty roads and across quiet rivers, connecting cities to rural outposts. The great fairs of Champagne, the bustling markets of Venice, and the ports of the Hanseatic League kept Europe humming with economic exchange. But when the plague struck, many of these arteries seized. Travel halted, ports closed, and fear of contagion brought once thriving routes to a near standstill. Traders fell ill on the road, ships remained moored, and caravans never returned. Entire industries, from spice trading to wool export, ground to a halt. Yet after the worst passed, something unexpected occurred. The desire for goods, comforts, and even luxury did not vanish. If anything, it grew stronger. Survivors, having lived through such darkness, found themselves longing for color, flavor, and novelty. Silk from the east, spices from the Levant, and furs from the north regained their allure, perhaps now tinged with deeper symbolism. To possess a bolt of soft cloth or a jar of saffron wasn't simply about status. It was about reclaiming joy. Trade, in this light, became more than economics, it became part of healing. Merchants responded to this renewed appetite by expanding their reach. Roads once feared as haunted by death now beckoned with promise. Ports reopened, cautiously at first, then with vigor. New routes were charted, especially to bypass regions still struggling to recover. Rivers, so central to the transport of goods, once again bore the weight of barges filled with cloth, salt, and timber. And with each new connection, towns that had once seemed isolated found themselves part of a growing web of exchange. In many places, trade hubs shifted. Cities that had weathered the plague better than their neighbors suddenly found themselves in positions of economic strength. Smaller towns along major routes grew as they accommodated increased traffic and demand. Inns reopened, marketplaces expanded, and craftsmen from surrounding villages came to sell their wares. These new trade centers reflected the resilience of the survivors, their ability to rebuild not just homes, but networks. The people who powered this revival were often different from the traders of old. With so many guild masters, merchants, and sailors lost to the plague, their children, apprentices, or even unrelated newcomers stepped into their roles. This changing of the guard infused the trade world with new energy. Younger merchants were often more willing to take risks, try new routes, or deal with unfamiliar partners. Their openness, born from necessity, gradually transformed the face of European commerce. Trade fairs, which had been suspended or scaled back during the plague years, returned with fanfare. Though some were smaller than before, they gained a deeper sense of importance. These fairs were not just economic gatherings. They became reunions for families, communities, and fellow survivors. Farmers brought grain and cheese, blacksmiths displayed tools, and merchants rolled up bolts of cloth from distant lands. The smell of spices mingled with roasting meat and freshly baked bread, while musicians played songs that reminded everyone that life, despite all, continued. One striking feature of this period was the increase in mobility. Before the plague, most peasants rarely traveled far from their birthplace. Ties to the land and feudal obligations kept people rooted. But the demographic upheaval caused by the plague shattered many of these bonds. Laborers who had survived were now in demand. They could leave their village and find work elsewhere, sometimes many miles away. This newfound mobility did not just bring wages, it brought perspective. Travelers encountered new dialects, customs, and ideas. They returned home with stories, knowledge, and in some cases, different expectations. Pilgrimage also re-emerged with renewed vigor, though now laced with a different kind of spiritual longing. Survivors walked to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, and Rome not only to seek absolution but to give thanks. Along the way, they encountered travelers from other regions, exchanging prayers, meals, and news. These journeys, deeply personal yet inherently communal, became another means by which ideas spread. A farmer from Yorkshire might return with a new way to till his soil, while a widow from Provence might bring home a lullaby learned from a fellow pilgrim. With this increase in movement came the exchange of not just goods and ideas, but people themselves. Marriages across regions became more common. A weaver from Bruges might wed a spinner from Milan, and their children would grow up speaking two tongues, learning two sets of skills. Cultural blending accelerated. Foods, clothing styles, and even songs began to reflect influences from afar. The sense of identity began to shift subtly. People still thought of themselves as English or Flemish or Tuscan, but now they were also part of something wider. Technological improvements in travel also played a role. Though the changes were incremental, they were meaningful. Horse-drawn carts became more durable. Roads were repaired and, in some cases, slightly improved. River barges were built with better hulls. In port cities, ship design saw small but steady advancements. Cogs and caravels, with their improved sails and larger cargo holds, became more common. These improvements allowed for safer and faster travel, encouraging merchants to push further afield. Some even dared to imagine journeys beyond the known map, inspired by tales from the East and the promise of undiscovered markets. In markets, coins changed hands quickly. The influx of new traders brought a variety of currencies, prompting towns to refine their systems of weights and measures. Local governments hired officials to inspect goods, settle disputes, and oversee taxation. Bureaucracy grew, but so did trust in the marketplace. Buyers began to feel more confident that their spices were not watered down, their wool not short-weighted. This reliability helped markets grow in reputation and size, drawing more traders year after year. Trade also created unexpected social opportunities. Individuals of humble birth who succeeded in commerce could rise in status. A former peasant who invested wisely in wool or cloth might become a respected merchant, even a town councillor. While the rigid class structures of medieval Europe remained, the doors between levels of society opened just a crack wider. Wealth alone did not guarantee respect, but it could purchase education, influence, and comfort. And for many, that was more than enough. This expansion of trade brought challenges, of course. Bandits returned to the roads, taking advantage of increased traffic. Cities had to rebuild walls, patrol gates, and monitor who came and went. But these problems were seen as signs of growth, not decay. When ships arrived with both goods and illness, memories of the plague's horrors stirred again. Quarantine measures were introduced, ships held at bay, travelers examined, goods fumigated. These early efforts at disease control were clumsy, but they marked the beginning of a new awareness, that with connection came responsibility. The cultural consequences of renewed trade were just beginning to unfold. Books and manuscripts, once locked away in monasteries, now changed hands in markets. A merchant might carry a romance from France, a medical treatise from Italy, or a philosophical dialogue from Spain. These texts were read aloud in inns, copied by students, and discussed over meals. Ideas no longer flowed solely from pulpit to pew, they moved with the caravans, ships, and wagons of the commercial world. Perhaps most importantly, the post-plague expansion of trade reminded people that life, though fragile, was still full of wonder. A bolt of blue cloth, dyed with indigo from far away, might be seen not just as a commodity, but as a miracle. A jar of cinnamon, rich with scent and warmth, could transform a simple meal into something sacred. The world, so recently defined by suffering, now shimmered with possibility. The survivors of the plague did not just return to their former routines. They reached outward, toward one another and toward lands unknown. They walked new roads, built new bridges, and carried not only goods but the hopes of a recovering world. Trade and travel had been reborn, not as luxuries, but as vital threads in the tapestry of medieval life. The years following the Black Death saw an eerie hush settle over much of medieval Europe. This silence, born from loss and uncertainty, gradually gave way to a new kind of expression, one woven from memory, reflection, and the stubborn will to live. In this new world, art, music, and storytelling became not only methods of entertainment or devotion but essential tools of healing and remembrance. The survivors did not merely continue old traditions, they transformed them. The way people painted, sang, and told stories shifted in tone and meaning. Art no longer only glorified saints and kings, it captured the experience of those who had endured. Before the plague, much of medieval art had been formal and symbolic. Figures were rigid, halos glowed with gold leaf, and scenes followed strict religious convention. Cathedrals and chapels were adorned with intricate designs meant to lift the viewer's eyes and thoughts toward heaven. But after the plague, something changed. Artists began to pay closer attention to the human face. Eyes were no longer blank or distant, they brimmed with emotion. Lines of sorrow etched their way into portraits. Scenes of biblical suffering became more visceral, more intimate. Viewers were no longer passive observers. They saw themselves in the stories. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a recurring theme in murals, woodcuts, and sculptures. This haunting motif depicted people from every walk of life, noblemen, merchants, farmers, bishops, all being led in a dance by skeletons. It was grim, yes, but not entirely hopeless. The message was both a warning and a reminder: death is universal, and so, therefore, is life. The dance of death unified people across social divides in a way few things could. It reminded them that in the face of mortality, all were equal. In illuminated manuscripts, marginalia, the whimsical or grotesque illustrations in the margins of texts, grew bolder. While some scholars debated their purpose, many now believe they served as quiet commentary on the world's absurdity and pain. Rabbits chasing knights, snails fighting warriors, monkeys dressed as priests. These strange images may have offered a form of catharsis. Amid the solemnity of scripture or liturgical text, humor peeked through. Survivors, having seen the worst, embraced both laughter and lamentation as part of the same breath. Tapestries and stained glass windows, too, began to tell different kinds of stories. Though biblical scenes remained dominant, more depictions of daily life crept in: farmers harvesting, women baking, children playing. These glimpses of the ordinary became sacred in their own way. They celebrated survival, resilience, and the beauty of the mundane. To hang a tapestry of a family at the hearth or a bustling village fair was, in essence, to declare, "We are still here." Music experienced its own quiet revolution. Before the plague, much of Europe's music was liturgical, designed for worship and largely confined to churches and monasteries. Gregorian chant, with its serene and floating tone, dominated sacred music. But after the plague, secular music gained prominence, both in public spaces and private homes. Minstrels and troubadours traveled from village to village, carrying with them songs of love, loss, and redemption. Lutes, harps, and fiddles accompanied tales that were increasingly personal. The lyrics spoke of empty homes, rekindled hope, and the search for joy in a changed world. New musical forms emerged. The ballad, a song that told a narrative story, grew popular among all classes. These songs preserved local legends, recounted real events, or honored the memory of those lost. Some were playful, others mournful. Many blended both. It was not uncommon to hear a song that made one laugh in the first verse and cry in the second. Music became a shared language, connecting people across regions and reminding them of what they held in common. Choral singing, once restricted to clerical choirs, began to find its way into community gatherings. Village festivals, wedding feasts, and even planting days included group songs. These were not performances for an audience, but acts of communion, voices blending not in perfection, but in participation. For people who had spent months or years isolated, this coming together of sound was a balm. In literature and oral storytelling, a similar transformation took place. The grand epics of knights and battles remained, but they were joined by more intimate tales. Folk stories emphasized cleverness over strength, kindness over conquest. A farmer outwitting a greedy landlord, a woman healing her village with herbs, a child discovering wisdom in the woods. These were the heroes of post-plague Europe. The stories reflected a world where survival itself was heroic. Collections of stories, such as the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, captured the spirit of the age. Written during and after the plague, the Decameron follows 10 people who flee the city to escape the illness, telling each other tales to pass the time. The stories range from bawdy to philosophical, from tragic to comic, but all are laced with the underlying knowledge of what they have left behind. The book resonated widely because it understood what so many felt, that humor, beauty, and storytelling were lifelines in times of suffering. In households, storytelling became more central. With fewer formal gatherings and less structured entertainment, families turned to each other. Grandparents told tales of the time before the sickness. Parents passed on local legends. Children added their own embellishments. Over time, these stories changed shape, adapted to their listeners, and became part of the local identity. A village might share a tale about a ghost who haunted the well, or a healer who saved lives with a mysterious flower. These stories, though sometimes fantastical, carried real emotions: fear, gratitude, loss, hope. Artisans found renewed purpose in illustrating these tales. Carvings on wooden furniture, scenes etched into pottery, and wall paintings in public halls told stories that once only lived in spoken words. A spinning wheel might bear the likeness of a fox bride. A chest might show a crow carrying a message between two lovers. These images preserved memory in a visual form, offering comfort and continuity. Children's games and songs adapted as well. Playful rhymes referenced the plague, sometimes in veiled ways. Lines about rings of roses or sneezing figures whispered truths that little ones only half understood. These games helped young minds process what they could not fully grasp, offering structure and rhythm to a world they were still learning to navigate. In all of this, a quiet cultural shift unfolded. beauty was no longer solely associated with grandeur or perfection. It was found in imperfection, in the hand-carved spoon passed down through generations, in a slightly off-key song sung at dusk, in the faded mural that still told its story. People no longer needed to be told that life was fleeting, they had lived it. What they wanted was to remember, and to be remembered. The survivors of the plague created a culture of depth. Their art, music, and stories did not shy away from sorrow, but neither did they wallow in it. Instead, they celebrated resilience, transformation, and the threads of connection that endured. Through every brushstroke, every note, and every tale shared by firelight, they stitched together a new tapestry of meaning. In the end, creativity became the pulse of a healing world. Where the plague had taken so much, it could not silence the human need to make, to share, and to dream. And in those acts of creation, the survivors found not just solace, but a way forward. The plague left behind more than empty homes and vacant fields, it left empty tables. The communal act of sharing food, once so central to medieval life, had been disrupted at every level. Villages lost entire households, markets collapsed, and supply chains withered. In the months and years following the worst of the devastation, the act of eating, where, what, how, and with whom, had to be reimagined. But as with so many parts of life after the Black Death, survivors didn't simply rebuild what had been. They adapted, adjusted, and in many ways improved upon it. Out of the silence, a new food culture began to grow, one rooted in practicality, shaped by scarcity, but also surprisingly rich in gratitude and innovation. In the immediate aftermath, food shortages were widespread. With fewer people to plant, tend, and harvest, many fields lay fallow. Grain, the foundation of most medieval diets, was in short supply, leading to higher prices and widespread hunger, even for those who had survived the plague itself. However, this scarcity was temporary. Once the initial chaos settled, the dramatically reduced population meant that there was, for the first time in memory, more land and food per person. The balance between people and resources had shifted. The survivors, though few, now had access to more fertile land, better grazing pastures, and in some cases, the tools and livestock of their deceased neighbors. Farming didn't just resume, it transformed. One of the first changes was the diversification of crops. Prior to the plague, much of Europe's farmland was dedicated to grain production, particularly wheat, barley, and rye. After the population collapse, landowners and farmers began experimenting with different kinds of agriculture. Peas, beans, root vegetables, and even orchards began to take up more space in the fields. These crops required less intensive labor than grain and offered better yields under changing conditions. Moreover, legumes enriched the soil naturally, helping to revitalize fields that had been exhausted by generations of overuse. Livestock farming also became more prominent. With fewer mouths to feed, herds of cattle, sheep, and pigs grew larger. Sheep, in particular, became central to the rural economy, not just for meat, but for their valuable wool, which fed into the growing textile trade. In some regions, whole villages transitioned from grain farming to sheep herding, changing the rhythm of life from harvest to pasture. With this shift came more dairy products, such as cheese and butter, making their way into everyday meals, not just the tables of the wealthy. The structure of agricultural labor changed as well. With fewer workers available, landowners had to offer better terms to keep peasants and tenants on their land. Many were granted fixed cash rents instead of being required to work the land in service. This allowed farmers more freedom to decide what to grow and how to manage their time. As a result, innovation flourished. Some families pooled resources to buy oxen or plows. Others invested in better tools or rebuilt barns using sturdier materials. The land was not just being used, it was being improved. Kitchen gardens became more essential than ever. Where once herbs and vegetables might have been luxuries, now they were necessities. Every home that could manage one kept a small plot for onions, garlic, cabbage, leeks, and medicinal plants. These gardens provided both sustenance and security. The sight of green shoots pushing through the soil became a symbol of survival. Children were taught to weed and water. Elderly neighbors shared growing tips. In this way, gardening became not just a task, but a communal tradition. The preparation and presentation of food also shifted. With more access to meat and a greater variety of vegetables, meals became more diverse in flavor and texture. Stews, the staple of medieval cuisine, grew heartier. Recipes were passed down, not through written texts but through repetition, song, and shared labor. A widow might teach her daughter how to season broth with wild herbs. A neighbor might show a young man how to smoke fish or cure ham. These techniques preserved food and also preserved memory. Communal meals, once structured around large feasts dictated by the church calendar or the Lord's table, became more intimate. While great feasts eventually returned, the smaller meals held in cottages, chapels, and town squares carried deeper meaning. To eat together was to affirm survival. Many families set aside empty places at the table in memory of the lost. Others began the meal with a shared prayer, not just of thanks but of remembrance. These quiet rituals, born of grief, gradually wove themselves into the fabric of daily life. Markets, once quiet, returned with new energy. Farmers brought surplus produce, craftsmen offered tools, and bakers displayed loaves made with mixed grains and dried fruits. The atmosphere was cautious but hopeful. Shoppers haggled with familiar vendors, exchanged recipes over baskets of apples, and brought home news along with goods. As the economy recovered, spices once again found their way into the kitchens of the middle class. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, once the domain of the elite, were used sparingly but meaningfully. A pinch in a stew, a dusting on a sweetened bread, these touches brought warmth and wonder to even the simplest meals. Baking saw a small renaissance. Communal ovens, maintained by villages or monasteries, became hubs of activity. Families took turns, carefully timing their doughs and marking their loaves with initials or symbols. The smell of baking bread became synonymous with normalcy. Children waited nearby for the warm crusts, while elders exchanged gossip and news. In many ways, these ovens were the heart of the village, offering more than food, they offered continuity. For those with access to writing, cookbooks began to appear in greater numbers. These weren't always practical guides, many were filled with elaborate recipes few could afford, but they indicated a growing interest in food as culture. Illustrations of dishes, lists of ingredients, and notes on preparation hinted at a new appreciation for the craft of cooking. In noble households, chefs became prized, not just for their skill but for their creativity. Menus expanded, and dishes became more regional, drawing on local ingredients and traditions. In religious institutions, food took on spiritual symbolism. Monks and nuns, who had survived the plague through isolation and discipline, began to emphasize the act of eating as a form of devotion. Simple meals were prepared with reverence. Fasting took on new meaning, not just as denial but as solidarity with the hungry. In some convents, special meals were held to honor those who had died, with each dish representing a virtue or memory. Bread for faith, herbs for healing, wine for joy. These meals were quiet, sacred, and deeply moving. Even the architecture of dining began to change. In wealthier homes, kitchens were expanded and given better ventilation. Chimneys improved airflow, while windows allowed in light and reduced smoke. Tables were made larger to accommodate extended family or neighbors. Benches replaced stools in some places, emphasizing togetherness. The very layout of homes began to reflect the centrality of food in rebuilding life. Children born after the plague were raised with different expectations. Their parents had seen the worst and wanted better for them, better food, better health, better traditions. Meals became teaching moments. Elders told stories over porridge. Mothers hummed songs while stirring stews. In this way, values were passed on: thrift, gratitude, generosity. A piece of bread was never taken for granted. A bowl of soup could bring comfort far beyond its ingredients. And as the decades rolled on, the table remained a central symbol of the post-plague world. It was where decisions were made, tears were shed, laughter returned. It was a place of nourishment and of memory. For survivors, it represented not just sustenance, but connection, to one another, to the past, and to the fragile hope of the future. The rebirth of food culture in the wake of the Black Death was not a return to old ways, but a gentle revolution. Out of scarcity came creativity. Out of loss came community. And around every table, from the grand halls of nobles to the humblest village hearths, the survivors of the plague reminded themselves, with every bite, every sip, every story told between spoonfuls, that life, no matter how uncertain, was worth savoring. In the long shadow of the plague, when so many lives had been cut short and entire households extinguished, the very idea of community had to be reassembled piece by piece. Where once a village might have known itself through generations of shared customs, festivals, marriages, and names, now it stood uncertain. Familiar faces were missing. Whole families had vanished. Yet amid the silence and sorrow, survivors turned not away from one another but toward each other. Community, like so many other aspects of medieval life, was not only rebuilt, it was reimagined. Before the Black Death, the social web of medieval life had been tightly woven. Each person had a role to play, lord and peasant, priest and layperson, merchant and craftsman, all bound by duty, custom, and a shared reliance on the rhythm of the seasons. But when the plague disrupted this order, those traditional bonds frayed. The lord might be gone, the priest buried, the market empty. The systems that once held people together, feudal obligations, church authority, family alliances, had been weakened. What remained was something more raw, more immediate, the will to survive together. In the first fragile years after the plague, communities gathered not around hierarchy, but around necessity. Those who remained often shared resources without question. A woman with extra grain offered it to neighbors. A boy strong enough to chop wood did so not just for his mother, but for the widowed woman down the lane. These were not grand gestures, but they sustained life. Out of the devastation grew a quiet ethic of mutual care, one that did not wait for permission or formal recognition. This new spirit of charity took root not just in households, but in the institutions that remained. Monasteries and churches, though greatly diminished in number and influence, found new purpose in their communities. With fewer clergy to maintain rigid hierarchies, lay people stepped into roles of service. Almsgiving became more localized and personal. Instead of donations to distant abbeys or faceless poor boxes, charity took the form of shared meals, hand-spun blankets, and baskets of vegetables left anonymously on doorsteps. In many towns, survivors formed informal networks of aid. These were not organized by guilds or governed by law, but by shared memory and moral obligation. If a household had lost all but one member, neighbors checked in. If a child had been orphaned, someone took them in. Entire villages adopted the responsibility of caring for their most vulnerable. Out of tragedy came a new understanding of kinship, not one rooted solely in blood or law, but in shared experience. This grassroots compassion began to influence how charity was formally understood. Town councils, recognizing the power of local generosity, began to set aside land, funds, or food specifically for relief efforts. Some established rudimentary hospitals, staffed not by physicians but by those willing to sit with the sick and offer comfort. Almshouses were built or repurposed to shelter the elderly, widows, and orphans. These were modest institutions, often little more than shared rooms with straw beds and simple fare, but they represented a shift, a recognition that society had a role in caring for its own. The spirit of charity extended to burial practices as well. In the darkest days of the plague, mass graves had been a grim necessity. But once the worst had passed, communities sought to honor the dead more fully. Survivors returned to unmarked burial grounds to place crosses, plant flowers, or say prayers. Some villages pooled funds to build memorial chapels or stone markers inscribed with the names of those lost. These acts were not mandated by the church or state. They came from the hearts of the living, determined to remember. Children born in the post-plague years were raised with a heightened sense of empathy. Their parents had known immense loss and survival, and they taught kindness not as an abstract virtue, but as a lifeline. Stories shared by the hearth spoke of neighbors helping neighbors, of courage shown in simple deeds. Young ones learned early to share what little they had, to listen before judging, and to offer help without being asked. In time, this ethos became part of the identity of whole communities. Festivals and public gatherings gradually returned, and with them came new customs rooted in this redefined sense of togetherness. Some towns began holding days of remembrance where food and gifts were distributed freely to those in need. Others introduced blessing rituals for tools, animals, or children, acknowledging the preciousness of daily life. Even long-standing traditions like harvest feasts or saints' days took on deeper meaning. They were no longer just celebrations of bounty or faith, they were declarations of survival. Art and architecture reflected this shift in communal values. In stained glass and wood carvings, scenes of saints healing the sick or feeding the hungry became more prominent. Painted frescoes in village chapels depicted not only heavenly miracles, but earthly acts of mercy. These images served as gentle lessons, reminding congregants that holiness was not confined to prayer. It lived in every act of care. Education, where it existed, began to include teachings on compassion. Children learned not just psalms and proverbs, but parables about kindness, generosity, and the moral worth of the least among them. In some households, a child's first lessons were not from books but from watching how their elders tended to the weak, or shared their last loaf with a hungry traveler. Charity was not institutionalized, it was inherited, like a cherished tool or song. Even the legal system began to evolve in subtle ways. Courts, once rigid enforcers of feudal privilege, occasionally ruled in favor of compassion. A woman might be granted a widow's property without strict documentation. A beggar might be allowed to stay in a barn through the winter. These decisions were not revolutionary, but they signaled an awareness that justice, in this new world, needed to include mercy. Pilgrims on the road, once seen as burdens or threats, were increasingly welcomed. Hospices near major routes offered beds and food. Villagers left water jars at crossroads. Some even built small shelters, nothing more than a roof and a bench, for travelers to rest. These gestures created a quiet culture of hospitality, echoing the belief that every stranger was, perhaps, a survivor like themselves. In guilds and workshops, the idea of mutual support grew stronger. Members looked after the families of those who had died, trained orphans as apprentices, and contributed to communal funds to aid those struck by misfortune. The guild oath, once focused on loyalty and trade secrecy, began to include promises of aid and support. Professional pride remained, but it was tempered by humility, a shared recognition that all had suffered, and all had been spared for a reason. Women played a key role in maintaining and expanding this culture of care. In the absence of formal institutions, they became the heart of neighborhood aid. Midwives, healers, cooks, and caretakers, their homes often doubled as refuges for the lonely or sick. Their networks, informal but effective, kept villages functioning in ways that laws and lords could not. And though their contributions were rarely recorded in official histories, they were etched into the memory of every child they fed, every wound they tended, every mourner they embraced. As the decades wore on, this reimagined sense of community became its own quiet legacy. The survivors of the plague did not rebuild their world to match the old one, they built a new one, shaped by the values they had forged in crisis. Compassion, once considered a private virtue, had become a public necessity. And in this, they created a foundation that would influence generations to come. At its heart, this chapter of post-plague life was about seeing one another not as peasants, merchants, or strangers, but as fellow humans, fragile, enduring, and deeply connected. In their acts of kindness, their shared meals, their remembered names, and their open doors, they wove a new fabric of belonging, one thread at a time. In the centuries leading up to the Black Death, the legal and political systems of medieval Europe had operated with a predictable rhythm. Power was hierarchical, rooted in land ownership and divine right. Local lords dispensed justice, the church oversaw moral behavior, and kings governed from afar, their word enforced by sheriffs and soldiers. The rules were clear, even when unfair, and society functioned within those constraints. But the plague shattered that rhythm. With so many lords, magistrates, clerics, and scribes lost to the sickness, the systems that had once ensured law and order began to fray. In the decades that followed, rulers and communities alike struggled to maintain control, redefine authority, and restore justice in a world that no longer looked the same. In the immediate aftermath, the collapse of governance was visible everywhere. Court sessions were cancelled due to a lack of judges or record keepers. Tax collectors went missing, and fines went uncollected. Laws that had once been strictly enforced were ignored out of necessity. Villages without leadership began resolving disputes internally, relying on elders or influential families to mediate. These informal systems worked to some extent, but they lacked the structure, consistency, and authority of official courts. This decentralization of justice opened the door to both creative solutions and dangerous abuses. Recognizing the need to re-establish order, kings and local rulers moved quickly to reassert control. But they faced a daunting challenge. The traditional tools of governance, manorial courts, church tribunals, regional assemblies, had been weakened by loss. Entire administrative branches needed to be rebuilt. In many cases, replacement officials were young, inexperienced, or poorly trained. Some were appointed hastily, chosen for loyalty rather than competence. As a result, governance became inconsistent. One village might enjoy fair and responsive leadership, while another languished under neglect or corruption. To complicate matters further, the dramatic population decline had shifted the balance of power between rulers and the ruled. Before the plague, landowners held nearly absolute control over the peasants who worked their estates. But after the plague, with labor in short supply and demand high, peasants could negotiate better conditions. This was unsettling to the ruling class, who viewed rising wages and labor mobility as threats to the established order. In response, many governments enacted restrictive laws designed to freeze wages and limit movement. One of the most well-known examples was England's Statute of Labourers, issued in 1351. It attempted to cap wages at pre-plague levels and prohibited workers from leaving their home villages in search of better opportunities. Violators were subject to fines or even imprisonment. Similar laws were enacted in other parts of Europe. These efforts were intended to restore feudal norms, but they largely failed. There simply weren't enough enforcers to police every village, and the will of the people had shifted. For many peasants, the memory of hardship fueled a quiet rebellion. They defied the laws by moving in secret, negotiating privately, or ignoring summons to appear in court. This growing tension between authority and autonomy culminated in several major uprisings. Most notably, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England revealed the depth of popular frustration. Sparked by a hated poll tax and years of wage suppression, thousands of peasants marched to London, demanding reforms. They called for an end to serfdom, fairer laws, and the dismissal of corrupt officials. Though the rebellion was ultimately suppressed, it sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Rulers realized that the old balance of fear and control had shifted. The people had found their voice. Elsewhere in Europe, similar movements emerged. In France, the Jacquerie uprising in 1358 saw peasants take up arms against noble landowners. In the cities of Italy and Flanders, guild members and apprentices challenged the dominance of wealthy merchants. These uprisings were not coordinated or ideological in the modern sense. They were desperate, passionate, and often violent responses to a world in which power felt increasingly disconnected from justice. Before the plague, medieval cities were hubs of trade, religion, craft, and governance. They were dense, vibrant, and often chaotic, centers of opportunity but also of hardship. Narrow alleys twisted through tightly packed neighborhoods. Markets overflowed with vendors shouting their wares. Churches, guild halls, and castles loomed over squares crowded with townspeople. But when the Black Death swept across Europe, these bustling cities fell eerily silent. Streets emptied, doors remained shut, and the great noise of medieval urban life was replaced by the quiet of mourning. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Businesses closed their shutters. The sick were quarantined, and the dead buried in haste. For a time, the city seemed to die. But like so many other aspects of life after the plague, cities were not lost, they were reborn. And in that rebirth came transformation. The demographic collapse hit cities especially hard. In densely populated urban centers, the plague spread rapidly. Merchants, clergy, laborers, and nobility alike fell victim. With population losses reaching 50% or more in many areas, cities that had once groaned under the weight of their residents now had room to breathe. Too much room. Entire sections of cities lay empty. Streets that had once been congested were now wide and quiet. Landlords struggled to find tenants. Guilds lacked apprentices. Churches echoed with empty pews. The very rhythm of city life had been broken. But the survivors began, slowly and cautiously, to fill that silence. Those who had lived through the worst returned to their shops, reopened their stalls, and reoccupied their homes. In the process, they redefined what it meant to live in a city. No longer just centers of commerce or power, cities became places of resilience and reinvention. And the changes that followed touched every aspect of urban life. One of the most visible transformations was architectural. With so many buildings abandoned or damaged, rebuilding was necessary. Some homes were torn down to create larger plots for surviving families. Others were repaired with sturdier materials. Narrow alleyways were widened. Streets were cleared of debris and regraded. In some cases, whole city blocks were redesigned. The result was a subtle but meaningful improvement in urban infrastructure. Airflow improved. The risk of fire decreased. Sunlight reached places that had long been in shadow. These practical changes had an impact not only on health and safety but on the spirit of the city itself. The marketplace, long the heart of any medieval city, returned to life with surprising energy. Merchants from surrounding regions moved in to fill the gaps left by plague victims. New stalls were erected. Produce, cloth, metal goods, and spices were once again exchanged with urgency. But the culture of trade had changed. Survivors were cautious. Haggling was softer. The lines between buyer and seller blurred slightly. Both had lived through the same storm. Trust became a more valued currency. People were more likely to buy from familiar faces. Reputation mattered more than ever. Guilds, once bastions of rigid tradition, began to show flexibility. With so many members lost, they had no choice. Rules governing apprenticeships were relaxed. Widows of craftsmen were allowed to continue their husbands' trades. Daughters were trained alongside sons. Entry fees were lowered to attract new members. While some guilds resisted these changes, others embraced them, seeing survival as a higher priority than protocol. These adjustments opened the doors of skilled labor to a broader swath of the population and subtly shifted the role of guilds from gatekeepers to community builders. Housing, too, saw a shift. With fewer people, demand for living space declined. Rents dropped. Poorer families, who had once crowded into tiny quarters, found themselves able to afford larger homes or move into better neighborhoods. In some cities, entire tenement blocks were repurposed into shared housing for extended families, apprentices, or laborers. This movement created more diverse neighborhoods, where people of different trades, classes, and backgrounds lived closer together. Social boundaries remained, but they softened in daily interactions. Urban cleanliness, long a challenge, received renewed attention. During the plague, filth and overcrowding had worsened the spread of disease. In response, city leaders began instituting simple public health reforms. Regulations required waste to be removed from streets more regularly. Butchers were moved to specific quarters, away from residential areas. Wells were protected with stone covers and drainage ditches improved. Though these efforts were primitive by modern standards, they represented the beginning of urban sanitation policy. People were starting to see cleanliness not just as a personal virtue, but as a public good. The role of public space also began to evolve. With more open land within city walls, spaces once crammed with buildings were converted into gardens, markets, or communal gathering areas. Some cities built new chapels or shrines in memory of those who had died. Others planted trees, opened green commons, or installed benches in busy squares. These spaces offered places for prayer, rest, and socialization, simple gifts to a weary population. They also became venues for storytelling, music, and impromptu celebrations. The city, for all its losses, was learning how to live again. Religion remained a central force, but it too adapted. Clergy who survived took on greater roles in civic life. They coordinated relief for the poor, tended to orphans, and helped organize funerals. In many cities, chapels were built not by the church but by guilds, neighborhoods, or wealthy families as acts of remembrance. The architecture of faith became more personal, smaller, more intimate, and embedded within daily life. Religious festivals returned, but with a changed tone. They were quieter, more reflective, but deeply cherished. Education, once dominated by cathedral schools and monastic institutions, began to diversify. Urban demand for literacy rose sharply. As merchants, officials, and guild leaders needed clerks and scribes, small private schools began to appear. These were often run by individuals rather than institutions. A retired cleric, a literate widow, or a former apprentice with a gift for numbers. Tuition was modest, and classes informal, but they served a vital purpose. In this way, knowledge, once the domain of the few, began to flow more freely through city streets. Communication also changed. With fewer people and more widespread literacy, written notices, letters, and proclamations became common. City councils posted ordinances in marketplaces. Guilds issued announcements on parchment. Families sent messages across town or to nearby villages. Paper, still a luxury, became more widely used, replacing cumbersome parchment. The city began to hum with a new kind of noise, not of carts and crowds, but of voices captured in ink. The arts, always tied to urban life, reflected the trauma and hope of the times. Painters depicted not only saints and royalty but merchants, workers, and families. Music filled the streets again, though the songs were slower, tinged with remembrance. Plays performed in public squares told stories of loss, loyalty, and love. Artisans found inspiration not only in faith or myth but in everyday survival. A sculpture of a mother cradling her child, a woodcut of a baker sharing his bread, these images honored resilience more than grandeur. Cities also saw changes in governance. With traditional noble families weakened or gone, local councils gained more power. These councils included merchants, guild leaders, and respected townspeople. Decision-making became more communal, if still imperfect. Rules about markets, construction, and sanitation were discussed publicly. Elections, though limited, gained importance. A spirit of civic duty emerged, not from idealism, but from necessity. The survivors knew that the health of the city depended on cooperation. Security improved as well. With fewer guards available, city watchmen were recruited from among local residents. Gates were monitored more carefully. Some cities built or improved walls, not just to repel invaders but to control disease. Quarantine stations were established outside city limits. Ships arriving in port were held for inspection. These early health measures, though inconsistent, showed a growing awareness that cities were living organisms, vulnerable, but capable of protection. Trade resumed, slowly at first, then vigorously. Merchants from other towns returned. Markets expanded. Goods flowed in: salt, wine, cloth, tools. People flowed in too: laborers, pilgrims, refugees. The city became a magnet again, not just for commerce but for hope. Those who had lost everything in the countryside came seeking opportunity. And many found it. Urban life after the plague was not easy, but it was vibrant. It bore the scars of loss, but also the fingerprints of renewal. In every shop reopened, every home repaired, every stone laid in memory, there was a quiet declaration: we are still here. Cities did not simply survive the plague, they evolved. And in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the cultural, political, and economic rebirths that would follow in centuries to come. From silence came song. From emptiness, possibility. The city, once on the brink of extinction, had found its second breath. As the 14th century waned and a new century emerged, the echoes of the Black Death still lingered, not just in memory, but in every field, church, school, and city that had been touched by its shadow. The survivors had not merely rebuilt what was broken, they had reshaped the world. Their choices, adaptations, and resilience gave birth to new social structures, altered religious beliefs, transformed economies, and quietly redefined the meaning of life itself. The legacy of the plague was not just devastation, it was transformation. The world before the Black Death and the world that followed were not the same, and the survivors carried that difference forward, generation after generation. The most profound legacy of all was a heightened awareness of mortality, and in turn, a heightened appreciation for life. The plague had taught that life was fragile, unpredictable, and precious. For many, this inspired a deeper reverence for everyday joys, a warm fire, a child's laughter, a full table. Art, music, and literature from the post-plague period brimmed with a sense of immediacy, of seizing the moment. Love poems spoke more boldly. Paintings captured not only saints and rulers but ordinary people, their faces filled with emotion. The simple act of living became, in many ways, an act of courage. Philosophically and spiritually, the plague left a subtle but enduring impact. The unquestioned authority of the Church had been tested, and while faith endured, it became more personal. People began to seek direct relationships with the divine, sometimes bypassing clergy to pray, interpret scripture, and serve others in their own way. This shift would eventually blossom into larger movements of religious reform in later centuries, but its roots can be traced to the hushed prayers and private rituals of plague survivors, to the widows who led candlelit devotions, the children who recited psalms from memory, and the laborers who carved small crosses into the beams of their homes. The role of the individual gained newfound significance. Before the plague, a person's life was often defined by birth, their class, trade, or lineage setting the boundaries of their future. But after the population decline and the upheaval it caused, social mobility increased. A farmer could become a landholder. A woman could run a business. An orphaned apprentice might rise to guild master. The rigidity of medieval hierarchy had been shaken, and while inequality persisted, the idea that a person's choices could shape their future took deeper root. Education and literacy, sparked by necessity during the recovery, began to spread more widely. More people learned to read, write, and count. Families prioritized the education of their children, not only as a path to better work but as a form of protection, a way to navigate contracts, understand law, and access the world beyond their village. This slow awakening of the mind laid the groundwork for intellectual revolutions to come. The seeds of curiosity that survivors planted would one day bloom into the Renaissance. Urbanization accelerated, driven by the movement of people seeking opportunity, safety, or a fresh start. Cities became more than centers of trade. They became incubators of culture and innovation. With greater contact between regions and a more mobile population, ideas traveled faster. Stories, fashions, remedies, and philosophies moved along with spices and silks. The fabric of society was now interwoven with the threads of shared experience, and those who had once feared outsiders began to see them as carriers of knowledge and possibility. In rural areas, land use continued to evolve. The old feudal systems struggled to reassert themselves but never regained their former grip. Serfs negotiated better terms or left entirely. Landowners, once lords in all but name, now had to listen, bargain, and adapt. The countryside did not become a utopia, but it did grow more balanced. Peasants had more voice, more security, and in some cases, more hope than ever before. Economically, the post-plague world saw the rise of a new middle class. Merchants, skilled artisans, and small landowners accumulated wealth and influence. They funded churches, sponsored artists, built homes of stone and timber. Their values, practicality, self-reliance, ambition, began to shape the culture around them. The growing use of money, rather than barter or feudal dues, shifted power dynamics. Contracts, wages, and market prices became the language of the new economy, and those who could read and negotiate them held real power. One of the more understated legacies of the plague was in medicine and public health. Though medical knowledge remained limited, communities had learned hard lessons. Clean streets, fresh air, and basic hygiene mattered. Cities created rudimentary health boards. Officials began tracking the movement of disease. Quarantine, once a desperate measure, became policy. Travelers were monitored, ships held offshore, and goods inspected. Over time, these practices evolved into more formal public health institutions, the early ancestors of hospitals and sanitation departments. The relationship between people and nature also shifted. The return of wilderness to abandoned farms reminded survivors that the natural world was both powerful and patient. Wildflowers bloomed where wheat once grew. Birds nested in empty bell towers. Forests crept toward village borders. Many found comfort in this, a sense that life continued, that renewal was possible. Herbal remedies, natural cures, and the rhythms of the earth were more deeply respected. The idea that nature could heal, could hold wisdom, took root in folklore, medicine, and daily life. In family life, traditions adjusted. Kinship ties remained important, but the experience of collective loss expanded the idea of who counted as family. Neighbors became surrogate aunts and uncles. Orphans were taken in without question. Godparents, once ceremonial, became deeply involved in children's lives. Meals were shared, holidays observed communally, and memory honored through song and story. Generosity was no longer a virtue reserved for the wealthy. It was a necessity of the heart. Architecture told its own story of recovery. The buildings constructed in the wake of the plague bore signs of both caution and hope. Homes had larger hearths, more storage, better ventilation. Churches featured stained glass windows that depicted not only saints and angels, but the people: farmers, bakers, grieving mothers, joyful children. Civic buildings displayed scenes of justice, charity, and daily work. The walls of the world had been rewritten with the language of lived experience. Children growing up in the generations after the plague were raised differently. They were taught resilience, frugality, and empathy. They heard stories of how things had been, how close the world had come to breaking. Their lullabies contained warnings, but also hope. Their lessons included prayers, math, and the names of herbs. They learned that life was both unpredictable and sacred. And as they grew, they carried with them not just the weight of history, but the possibility of shaping it. As time passed and the memory of the plague faded, its legacy remained, not just in books or buildings, but in the quiet shifts that guided daily life. The way people greeted one another with kindness. The way they washed their hands before a meal. The way they made room for a neighbor at the table, even if they'd already eaten. These habits, born of crisis, became culture. In the grand arc of history, the Black Death was one of the greatest catastrophes ever faced. But in its aftermath, something remarkable happened. Those who remained didn't simply mourn, they learned. They adapted. They reached for one another. And in doing so, they shaped a new world, one stitched together with memory, courage, and the quiet strength of survival. Their legacy was not written in monuments or decrees, but in the continued beating of the human heart, stronger, wiser, and forever changed. And so, our journey through the quiet resilience of the past comes to a close. As we've seen, the survivors of the plague didn't just pick up the pieces. They rewove the entire tapestry of their world. From the way they worked and worshipped to how they loved, remembered, and dreamed, every thread of medieval life was touched by their endurance. Their choices, both great and small, gave rise to a new way of living. One not defined by what they had lost, but by how they chose to move forward. If this story helped ease your mind, feel free to leave a gentle like or share where and when you're listening. Your presence here means more than you know. And if you'd like to continue exploring these quiet corners of history, there are many more stories waiting just beneath the surface. For now, let the echoes of the past fade gently into silence. Close your eyes. Rest well. And know that even in the darkest chapters of history, the light of human resilience continues to shine.